Welcome back to the Eastern Mediterranean Times Weekly Podcast. I'm your host, Martin Mond.
And I'm your host, Joshua Litke.
All right, jumping right into it. The U.S. closes in on a deal to pause the conflict in Gaza and release at least some of the hostages. This week, multiple high-ranking officials from the United States, Qatar, and Israel have met in a coordinated effort to try to release some of the hostages that were taken on October 7th on the attack on Israel. This meeting is also trying to coordinate humanitarian pause so that aid can get to the Palestinians who desperately need it.
Yeah, so we're looking at right now a kind of joint effort, the United States and the Israelis on one side, and then Qatar representing Hamas on the other side of this, trying to get a at least temporary peace deal. So one of the key facets of it is the hostages in this situation. The Hamas has seemed like it's willing to allow for the release of women and children hostages. However, they do want to, at the moment, keep male and military hostages. But Israel seems to be open to at least getting women and children back into the country. We're also looking at the pause of the conflict for 5 days in Gaza, which would allow for more humanitarian relief. And that's a big aspect of it, where the United States has been trying to push for more medical aid, more food, more shelter, all this kind of stuff, and especially fuel, which has been a big ask for Israel, but they finally caved into U.S. requests for them to give fuel relief.
Yeah, and one of the most important parts to remember about the fuel relief is that they need fuel in order to operate water pumps and in order to cook food. And so if you supply Gaza with water or food, they still need fuel in order to become more self-sufficient. And that's one of the most important parts here. They also need it so that they can travel from point A to point B and to actually get that humanitarian aid across the entire Gazan Strip.
Yes, and also to power the hospitals as well, which have been suffering and pretty beleaguered during the conflict.
Absolutely. All right, and looking more in Israel, the U.S. is looking into reprimands for violent Israeli settlers in the West Bank. President Biden has reportedly directed top officials to prepare visa bans and sanctions for extreme Israeli settlers. The settlers in the West Bank are considered by the international community as illegal settlers in many instances, and many times they have caused for violence throughout the West Bank. The settlers have also caused for a real threat to a two-state solution as the United States has seen it, and have undermined the legitimacy in many instances of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. President Biden sees settler violence as a serious threat to peace among Israelis and Palestinians, and it has destabilizing potential throughout the entire Middle East.
Yeah, well, as you said, it's the two-state solution part that's really critical. The Biden administration and most Democrats in the country are strong supporters of the two-state solution in Israel and Palestine, and any settlement activity in the West Bank, especially considering the West Bank is under the control of the more moderate Palestinian Authority, is definitely seen as a threat to long-term peace and stability in the region. And it also goes to Biden's moves for de-escalation, which he's been pushing a lot. U.S. allies have been pushing a lot to get this conflict to a peaceful resolution as fast as possible, where Israel is able to maintain its sovereignty, but also Palestinians are able to get out of the zone of conflict.
Absolutely, and it's important that we don't overlook the fact that even though most of the violence has happened in the Gaza Strip since October 7th, there also has been continuous violence in the West Bank, and that violence is not entirely guaranteed to end if there is a small ceasefire deal brokered in Gaza.
Yeah, well, I mean, many of the experts have said and pointed to the situation in the West Bank being the reason why Israel's military wasn't able to respond so rapidly to Hamas's attacks from Gaza, because so much of the Israeli military was positioned to protect settlers in the West Bank, so they needed to move across the country to get to Gaza.
Yeah. All right. And then moving on to the next story, the international community putting a foot down on Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. Bashar al-Assad was convicted of war crimes after the Syrian civil war in 2011. This week, the UN judges have led in order to stop the Syrian government from torturing prisoners and opponents. The UN further blaming al-Assad for human rights abuses and for quelling opposition through fear-mongering.
Yeah, and French judges, on top of this, have issued an international arrest warrant for Assad, definitely finding him guilty of humanitarian crimes similar to that of the United Nations claims. Assad is no stranger to this. He's faced plenty of sanctions by the international community for his actions during the Syrian civil war and for the human rights violations that him and his government and military committed. But this is definitely the United Nations and the globe trying to ensure that, at least on a symbolic level, they are still trying to hold Assad accountable and ensure that other dictators do not follow in his steps and take actions to severely violate human rights.
Yeah, one of the most interesting parts to this story is that the United Nations coming out against al-Assad officially, which in the past has been something that they weren't all able to do because it would have been vetoed by Russia and the Russian delegation to the United Nations.
Yes.
Because the Russian delegation was pretty closely tied with al-Assad in its efforts in Syria, and especially in its efforts during the Syrian Revolution. And this comes as a turning point as Russian influence in Syria definitely wanes and other powers seem to be more prevalent in the region, such as Turkey and the United States and Iran.
Yes, indeed.
Now, shifting over to Italy, the Italian energy market is shaken up once again. The new CEO of Enel Corp could stall the green energy transition in Italy.
Yeah, so led and spearheaded by the Italian government and Giorgia Meloni, Enel Energy Company is probably going to be backtracking on some of its previous renewable energy targets. So this is a big deal because Enel is the largest renewable energy developer in the world. And so we're looking at the former CEO, Francisco Starisi, has essentially been ousted and is being replaced by Flavio Cattaneo, who is going to be leading the company and has seemed, while he hasn't necessarily said anything out loud yet, it seems likely that he will be looking to be more selective on renewable energy projects and will focus more on projects within the country of Italy. So domestically, this means that Enel will definitely be taking a step back in the amount of renewable energy projects that it is creating. But that being said, they're going to need to be careful about peeling back too much because then they will need to be getting energy from other European partners in order to actually meet the demands that the energy grid in Italy is looking for. And internationally, Enel is also, since considering it's such a large developer, it's leaving a hole in the market that will definitely need to be filled by other companies and threatening that green energy transition globally.
Absolutely, and especially the green energy transition is drastically important in the Eastern Med. We've seen this year the effects of climate change on the likes of Greece, Tunisia, Algeria,
Italy as well.
And transitioning to green energy is one of the lead ways of reducing some of those harmful impacts of climate change. And there is a big market for it right now. The Greek Prime Minister saying that they're looking at investing more into green energy and into sustainable development. That's a common goal across the region, especially in the European continent. And there is a large market for this. So when NL steps down, it'll be interesting to see who fills that market because I doubt that it'll be left empty.
Yes, indeed.
All right, this has been the Eastern Mediterranean Times. I was your host, Martin Mond.
And I'm your host, Joshua Litke.
Have a great week.